Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the ARC of Massachusetts webinar series. I'm happy to have Sean Roy from TransCen and the Youth Employment Solutions Center be our presenter today. This series with Sean, both today and tomorrow, is hosted actually through the Massachusetts Partnership for Transition to Employment, and it's a collaboration to help provide more opportunities for youth for actual employment before they leave schools and in their young adult future. So anyways, before we get started, I just wanted to give you a few tips about today's webinar. I would love to actually first find out who's with us today. So if you could chat into me if you are a parent. Okay, terrific. If you're a professional, can you chat into me? We have about 5 parents on the line. Okay, anybody else? How about, do we have any self-advocates on the line today? We've got actually 2. We've got someone who's an IEP coordinator, which is great. So we got a teacher on today, and several more families. So anyways, okay, this sounds good. What I also wanted to let you know is if you're having any problems hearing us, please just chat into me. I'm the host, and you can just chat into me, and I'll send you a private message. At the end of this webinar today, you will also be sent a copy of the PowerPoint. So that will be done as well. And everybody's been muted upon entry. Please do not unmute yourselves because we do record these sessions. They will be available on our YouTube station at the ARC of Massachusetts, so you can view it later on. And the quality of the audio really makes a difference. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Sean. We're going to be hearing the presentation first, and then leaving the last 15 minutes for questions. So thank you, Sean. I'll let you take it from here.
Wonderful. You hearing me okay, Carrie?
I can hear you great. Yep.
This wonderful. All right. Thank you, Carrie, for having me. My name is Sean Roy, and I am with TransCen. I can talk a little bit more about TransCen a little bit later. I'm also with the Youth Employment Solutions Center. And today we're going to talk about raising the bar, seeing employment as part of our children's future. I have been doing presentations for families for almost 20 years now. I think it's a privilege. I thank everybody for taking time out of their afternoon to be here today, and also the professionals that are here, maybe learning a little bit more about how to partner with families. So this is fun for me, and I appreciate being asked. We're going to shoot for about 45 to 50 minutes of content. We'll do questions at the end. So if you have questions, please just write them down and save them until we are finished. And so, let's see, I'm trying to advance the slide here, and it's not letting me completely advance the slide. Carrie, you might need to be the slide person because I'm not able
Okay.
to advance the slides this particular point. So today what we want to talk about, again, the presentation is aimed at families who are thinking about employment, might have questions about employment, wondering where employment fits into their lives of their son or daughter with a disability. But I have always found that the information is also valuable to professionals as well, and I hope that you find it that way. We're going to talk a little bit about why are we talking about employment, why is it important, a little bit about what we mean when we talk employment, helping families see things in a different way, some tips for families on preparing young people to be successful in the world of employment, just a little bit about Social Security benefits, and then maybe some action steps. And that might be a great place in the chat box or at the end to kind of tell us what, based on the information you heard, what are some of the things that you would like to do right away to help your son or daughter on that path to employment success. So next slide, please. A little bit about me. That's my picture. I always feel a little bit strange. The background is, yes, a white snowy day here in Minnesota. That is where I am from. Carrie tells me it's 82 and sunny today. It is not snowing in Minnesota yet, but it will soon. I come to you as a parent advocate and a parent training professional that, again, has been doing this work in the area of 20 years. First and foremost, I am a sibling of a brother who is 8 years my junior. He is on the autism spectrum. Somewhere I would call him, moderately functioning autism. Much of the reason why I do this work, probably the entire reason why I would gravitate towards this type of work, is my experience as being a sibling and having a family member with a disability. And I draw upon my experience with my brother quite often in the talks that I do. I've also been a family advocate. I had worked at a large national family advocacy center, the Pacer Center here in Minneapolis, for 15 years before I made the switch over to TransCen. And much of my responsibility as a family advocate was working directly with families, answering questions regarding employment, regarding transition, access to post-secondary education. I did a lot of parent training sessions such as this, a lot of professional trainings, did a lot of writing on the topic. I was lucky enough in my job to be able to focus almost solely on transition and employment, and I draw from that experience as well. And currently I am a trainer. I do a lot of presenting at conferences and professional training on a wide variety of topics, including family engagement. And so that's who I am. I always think it's important for people to know who's talking to them. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about what's going on today, specifically for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. When it comes to envisioning a future of employment for our sons or daughters with disabilities, especially those with high support needs, it's important for us to get a sense of what's happening overall in the country when it comes to opportunities for people with disabilities. Today, we see people with disabilities being able to engage in hobbies, being able to be competitively employed in the community alongside people without disabilities. We see them owning their own home. We see them owning their own businesses. We see people with disabilities in relationships and in some cases getting married. I find that the perception of what is possible for people with disabilities is changing pretty rapidly. We see more appropriate representation of people with disabilities in the media, in movies and television. We see increased understanding of what individual disabilities may bring and what support needs people may need. And so I think it's important for us to start off with this very positive idea that today people with disabilities are achieving great things. And that includes great things in employment. The next slide, please. But that's not to say that there isn't still work that needs to be done. I'm not going to sit here and paint an overly rosy picture of the lives of people with disabilities in our country. There's still a long way to go for us before people with disabilities experience equality of opportunity in this country. We know that, for example, employment rates for people with disabilities tend to lag very far behind those without disabilities. We know that many people with disabilities tend to live at or below the poverty line, having a difficult time being able to earn enough income in kind of today's current structure. The housing options are very limited. We have, in a lot of states, we have old models of group homes, which don't always fit the new, flexible needs and the desire to live independently in the community for a lot of people. And affordable housing in general around the country is a struggle, and it's especially seen for people with disabilities. A lot of people with disabilities will graduate from high school, and then they will have limited connections socially, recreationally, or with personal relationships. And it's also difficult, too, for people with disabilities to establish themselves as a respected person, not only in the community, but also just in their own planning. Are they being listened to when it comes to where they're going to live or where they're going to work? And it's this idea of involving people in their own lives is something that should be intuitive, but it's something that we continue to struggle with. Next slide, please. It's important when we talk about employment that we clarify a little bit what it is that we're talking about. When we're talking about employment, employment's going to look different for everybody with a disability, the same way employment looks different for people without disability. What we're trying to do today is really build some hope and get you to see employment as a possibility and maybe steer you towards the right questions to ask. So we want to help families to see that there is value in employment. And that may seem like a strange statement, but I have worked with families in the past that employment does not come very high on the hierarchy of needs for their son or daughter. And I certainly understand it. I understand how employment can be somewhat of an afterthought when you're trying to figure out what is going to happen during the day for their son or daughter. How are you going to manage disability? How are you going to manage health? How are you going to manage your own employment in your own family life? But we're here to talk about employment because there's a lot of value in it. There's a lot more to it than just going somewhere and just having something to do during the day. We also want to help people see that work is possible, that people with disabilities, including those with high support needs, can be employed competitively in the community. And it has happened. It is happening, and helping families see that this is an option. And also, too, we want to offer information and resources so families can make their own informed decisions. We are certainly stressing the importance and benefits of employment. But we're not, well, really the ultimate goal here is to arm people with accurate information so you can make choices based on accurate information and not make choices based on assumptions or myths that might be out there around, what people with disabilities can or cannot do. Sometimes we get pushback on this idea of employment for competitive employment for people with disabilities because we are talking about competitive employment in the community. We are not talking about employment in an enclave alongside people with disabilities. We're not talking about going to a separate site or a sheltered workshop for employment. That is not what we mean by community-based competitive employment. So we are talking about that in terms of the option, but what we're not trying to do is we're not trying to take anything away from families. We're not trying to put people at risk. We're not trying to push people into programs they don't want. Simply, we want to give you the information that is necessary for you to make these types of decisions and help you understand that the world is changing and that there are a lot more options now for community integration and employment than there used to be. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Or is that me? Oh, here we go. Perfect. So again, when we talk about employment, we are talking about paid employment in the community, being on the payroll of a business, working alongside people with or without disabilities. And we're also talking about employment in a field that really closely relates to what your son or daughter wants to do. That's kind of the ultimate vision of employment. But when we start with this concept of employment, there are a few core concepts that I like to touch on, especially when I'm talking with them. And we're going to continue to hear some of these themes throughout the presentation. First and foremost, everyone can work, right? Everybody has some kind of a talent or some kind of an ability that, if supported, will allow them to be able to be competitively employed. There are people out there we recognize with very high support needs, and that may mean that work looks a little differently for them. And so the second core concept is that work does look differently for everybody. A lot of people, when we talk about employment, they want to default to, my son or daughter can't work 40 hours a week. My son or daughter can't work 30 hours a week. And we acknowledge that, absolutely. It's going to look different for everybody based on their own unique situation. So when we look at work, we really need to look at it through the lens of what a person's abilities are, and recognize that those abilities are likely to change over time. So right now, work may be 10 hours a week, but in a year or 3 years or 5 years, that may change to 15 or 20 hours a week. We're always growing, and we don't always acknowledge that people with disabilities have that same ability to grow and to mature and to master skills as well. And that I mentioned this, the third concept is earlier, employment should be rooted in what your son or daughter wants to do. A lot of times in the past, employment opportunities for people with disabilities were basically assigned based on what was available. And there were some notorious job areas that people would usually get funneled into. Either, cleaning or fast food or being a greeter or, a lot of these, basic jobs that there were, a high demand for. What we're really advocating for is that, employment should start with an understanding of who your son or daughter is and what it is that they like to do, what skills and talents they have, and how do you match that to a job that they're going to be good at and be happy with. So those are the core concepts that we really like to stress when we talk about employment. Now let's move on to the next slide. You may have heard the concept of employment first. I know that in 2010, Massachusetts adopted a policy which is written on the slide here regarding employment first. And I would say right now that the majority of states around the country have adopted employment first, either language or executive orders or actual pieces of legislation. One thing to keep in mind about this concept of employment first is that it is not a program. You don't call somebody and say, can I get enrolled in the Employment First program? Employment First is a philosophy. It's the idea that paid competitive employment should be the first and preferred option for people with disabilities. And what this idea is in response to is the practice of automatically referring people with significant disabilities into segregated settings, such as sheltered workshops or day programs that had no employment component whatsoever. And there are, around the country, unfortunately, a lot of people who have the ability to be employed in the community who had, just by virtue of their disability, been automatically put into these programs and never asked or given the opportunity if they wanted to work in the community. So Employment First really holds as the value that community-based employment is the best option. We're talking individualized employment, so not as part of a group or an enclave. We're talking integrated employment, employment that's alongside people without disabilities with opportunities to interact with all of the employees, employment in the general workforce, on the payroll of a business or self-employed. So not necessarily, a lot of times people will have jobs in the community, but their check comes from an employment agency. And certainly, we prefer that they actually be employed by the business and at minimum wage, above or at whatever the industry standard wage is. And this idea of sub-minimum wage has gotten a lot of attention. A lot of people with disabilities are out there working for, pennies on the dollar when they had the ability. And in many cases, we're doing the same jobs as people who are getting paid a lot more money. So when we think about Employment First and when we think about employment in general, these are really some of the concepts that we want to keep in mind, both as families and as professions. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, excuse my water drinking here. As I mentioned in the past, in many states, and I'm not trying to separate Massachusetts in any way, shape, or form. I'm not aware of the practices in Massachusetts that I can speak, intelligently about them. But I do know that in many states, students with significant disabilities, their transition plan from high school was basically, you are going to go into this sheltered workshop. You're going to go to this employment program and get paid sub-minimum wage. And you may be working and you might not be working. But that's the only option that was offered to people. And really what we want to do is we want to offer a new path or a new idea to employment for families who may have heard that. If you're a family who may have heard that, the best option is one of these programs, let's just offer a different idea here just for a second. And this is a graphic that I came up with that sets forth, here's the way an employment success can look for a young person. First and foremost, we need families to have high expectations that employment in the community is possible. Families, and we're going to talk a lot about high expectations here coming up here in a minute, but families having high expectations is extremely, extremely important. Those high expectations can lead to young people building skills and exploring careers. And by building skills, it can be something as simple as, having chores in the house. And by exploring careers, that's certainly something that can be done in the school. Getting some kind of sense of what it is that they want to do, based on who they are and what they like and their talents and their skills, what kind of careers do they want to explore? The third step in the path would be youth setting a vision for themselves. So I've explored some careers, I've built some skills. I know that my mom and dad want me to work, so here's what I think I'd like to do. And conveying that vision and having adults in their lives that listen and respect that vision and help support what that vision is. The fourth step would be supports that promote community employment. So again, the key word there is community employment. We are trying to steer away from supports that are going to promote segregated settings or isolation. We want supports that say employment in the community is really what our outcome is, and we're going to help you try to reach it. The fifth step would be then getting meaningful work experiences. Now, those supports in step 4 can be the school, it can be the family, it can be a program such as vocational rehabilitation or a community-based employment program. Those supports can come from a lot of places. And we're going to talk about the benefits of meaningful work experiences coming up here. Ultimately, this all leads to the goal of a job in the community. And you'll see in parentheses that I state, pretty clearly, with or without supports. Again, employment is going to look differently for everybody. And a successful employment outcome might be 15 hours a week in the community with a job coach. That would be a support, and that's okay. That is a success. So just to consider, this is a different way to look at how employment can be achieved for young people with disabilities, trying to bypass some of those other segregated settings. Let's move on to the next slide. So I know that every once in a while when working with families who are a little bit older, families who maybe have not been immersed in the ADA or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or some of these supports and civil rights pieces that we have right now in this country. I have been asked point blank by some of these families, why should my son or daughter work? They have a disability, why should we make them work? This doesn't make any sense to me. And so this slide really is to help people see what are some of the benefits of working. And first and foremost, it's what is expected of adults. In our society, we put a high value on working. When you go to a party and you meet somebody for the very first time, almost inevitably, the first question that's going to come up is, what do you do? That's how we connect to people. It's pretty amazing, in fact, in our society, the value that we put on, what it is that you do. So it's what is expected of adults, and we should expect the same thing for people with disabilities because they are adults. It provides opportunities for socialization. I know, for example, my brother, again, who's 40, and he works at a medical manufacturing facility here in the Twin Cities, and he gets great value out of going to work every single day, interacting with his coworkers. The coworkers are amazing. And he goes to things like company picnics and outings, sports and bowling and all of this stuff. And he has this entire social network that he has built based on the fact that he is employed at this place. And it's a very beneficial thing for him, and it's enhanced his life a great deal. Being able to be employed offers a lot of self-worth, a lot of dignity. It offers a purpose to wake up in the morning and to contribute to society. Certainly it offers income and some money. And we're going to talk about the intersection of benefits in that. But earning your own paycheck is a very impactful thing. I think we can all remember our first paycheck. In whatever situation it might have been. I remember I worked at a little general store in the town in Minnesota where I grew up, and I got my very first paycheck was for $34 in 1986. And I ran out and I got a pair of Reeboks, white Reeboks that I had my eye on. And that feeling that I had worked and I had gotten this money and I had earned this money to go out and buy my own stuff was incredible. And it's something, I think that we all feel. And certainly because they can. People with disabilities should work because they can work. The picture in the slide is a young man who you may be familiar with. He owns a company called Poppin' Joe's Gourmet Kettle Corn, and his name is Joe Steffi. He's a young man with Down syndrome and autism and limited verbal skills, and he operates this kettle corn business to, great success in the Kansas and Georgia area. He got some support through vocational rehabilitation and Social Security and the Kansas Developmental Disabilities Council to start his business. He obviously gets support through friends and family to be able to operate his business at various events and county fairs and that type of stuff. But the young man currently, the business that he owns, experiences an annual sale of $75,000 a year. And his is a man with a profound, impactful disability. Again, everybody can work, and they should work because they can. Let's move on to the next slide here, because I want to talk a little bit about expectations. Expectations, I believe, are probably the main thing. And if you could flip to the next slide, Carrie. Expectations are the main thing that impact our perception of what a person with a disability can or can't do. And I found this definition to be somewhat helpful. And it says, expectations are quick predictions about how much value someone's contributions will add to the task at hand. If the value of someone's contributions is predicted to be high, that person will receive more opportunities to contribute. Conversely, if their contributions are predicted to be low, their opportunities are going to be less. And I think that we often think that people with disabilities, including especially those with high support needs, do not have much to offer the task at hand, which is employment. And I think that's why families and educators and employment program staff and even young people themselves have relatively low expectations of how they can be employed, or even if they should be employed. So let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about where do some of these low expectations come from. So if you're a family member of a young person with a disability, you have been inundated with negative messages about your son or daughter's disability probably since birth. And in many cases, these negative messages, continue throughout the lifespan. A lot of times it's inadvertent, but it's still there. And families feel those negative messages. And over time, I think that those negative messages really lead to a lowering of the expectation of what their son or daughter will achieve, in the community. We've come a long way in this country about the perception of disability, but for the most part, we still make pretty quick predictions if we see a person with a significant disability about what it is that they're going to be able to do. I think low expectations are also impacted by the feelings that parents have about having a son or daughter with a disability. And it requires families to, in many cases, shift what they thought, the life would be like for them and for their son or daughter when they hear that they have a son or daughter with a significant disability. This is a significant, impactful event, and families oftentimes have very real, valid feelings and fears about what that's going to mean. And certainly, low expectations come from what we're told by others, what we're told by doctors right away when your son or daughter's born, or by the psychiatrist or psychologist that may have diagnosed at age 3 or 4 or 5, or the early childhood specialist, or the special education teacher, or a well-meaning family member. All of these lead to low expectations. And what we're trying to get at with this information is that, the secret really is seeing that people with disabilities can do great things. That's why we've hammered on that point in the beginning part of this presentation. And not letting other people's ideas impact your son or daughter's ability to make lives for themselves. You, as the family member, are the person that should really set that expectation. And why is it important to have that high expectation? Well, let's look at that on the next slide. Now, go back one, please. There we go. So we've talked about a lot of these things, but families setting the bar for how the rest of the world sees their son or daughter. And I've said that in my presentations for years, that if a mom and dad come in and say, oh, my son or daughter can't do this, or my son or daughter can't do that, well, that's exactly how the rest of the world is going to see that child. And yes, disability means that people sometimes have difficulty doing the same things that other people don't have as much difficulty doing. But if you convey that low expectation, then everybody else is going to have the low expectation too. So having high expectations may lead to avoiding those restrictive programs and placements that we talked about, such as sheltered work or enclaves or group homes. It may mean that your son or daughter might have a life in the community of their choosing, where they want to live, around the people they want to live, living where they want to live, the lives based on their own dreams and their own goals for themselves. And also a life where seeing that risk is good and failure can be constructive. We learn from our failures. We learn from our shortcomings. And a lot of times families don't want to put their son or daughter in a position where they're going to fail. But in fact, having high expectations means it's okay if you fail. Failure is an option because that's how we learn and that's how we move on and that's how we succeed. We do have a couple points about this too I wanted to point out. So the next slide here is called, I titled it the balancing act. And I just like to, I want to be honest and open and respectful to the families that we're talking to and that we're working with all the time. And I don't want to sugarcoat life because I know life, you're living the life and we're not living the life that you're living. And we're expecting you to engage in a balancing act. And we're expecting you to have high expectations for your son or daughter and to consider and embrace competitive employment. When in many cases, we know that your son or daughter may have some very complex needs. And we also know that what you're used to are systems and programs based on deficit. You're told, for example, that eligibility for your son or daughter to get into programs are based on the severity of their disability. It's based on not what they need, but based on what they can't do. That's how we've built our systems, unfortunately. So I just want to acknowledge that we are asking families to do two things at once. Have a high expectations, but also to be able to navigate the systems that are put in front of them to be able to get the supports that their son or daughter needs. The next slide, please. The other concept that I like to talk about is this idea of the longer runway. Our society has constructed this idea that people need to reach certain milestones at certain times, and young people in particular, that at age 17 or 18, you're going to graduate high school and you're going to go to college or you're going to go into a trade. At age 22, you're going to graduate from college and you're going to move on to graduate work or you're going to go into the workforce. And somewhere around age 25, 26, 30, whatever, you're going to get married and have a family. And, all of these milestones are artificially constructed. And I think families of kids with disabilities often feel badly that their son or daughter are not reaching these milestones that we've created artificially. So I like to tell families that it's okay. Every person grows and achieves at a different rate. My brother, for example, I could say that he was probably firmly set in his life and transitioned into his own adulthood when he was about 32. That's when we had his housing situation settled, his employment situation settled, his transportation situation settled, and he was connected to social and recreational activities, both at work and outside of work. But there was a lot of bumps in the road. And along the way, you come to realize that this is going to happen at its own speed. So we live in a now world, but this is going to happen for your son or daughter when it's meant to happen. Don't worry that it's not happening at the same time that it's happening for other kids because it's just not really worth it to fret about such things. The next slide is something I touched on a little bit regarding this idea of success. So can we switch to the next slide, please, Carrie? What is success? And I want you to think of a couple of things that you would not be successful at on your first try. And the thing that pops into my head is running a marathon. And I know I'm talking to people in Massachusetts, home of the greatest marathon ever. I've always wanted to be a runner, but I don't think I have the back or the knees for it. So if you gave me the task of running a marathon, said, Sean, we want you to run a marathon, I would not be successful at it. I would not be able to run a mile of that marathon, very likely. But I might be able to work myself up gradually over time to be able to run a 5K. And for me, that would be success. I'd love to be able to do that. So success in employment is an ongoing process, and it looks differently for everybody, right? It may mean success would be going from 10 hours of work or 5 hours of work to 10 hours of work. Success might be moving from menial tasks to a little bit more responsibility. It may mean being able to tolerate work a little bit better without breaks or without outbursts. And we should always recognize and celebrate success no matter how small it is. I was doing a presentation in Michigan a few months ago, and I brought up this idea during my presentation, and a mom came up to me afterwards and said, you know, my daughter has got complex medical needs. She's got brain tumors, and she requires surgery. And she said, you know, a lot of people are trying to push me into employment, but I'm just trying to keep my daughter out of the hospital. She said, my definition of success would be if my daughter could stay out of the hospital for 3 months. She said, at that point, that's when I would be willing to think about employment. And I thought it was such a great example that we're all living our own lives. We're all having our own realities, and success is going to look different for everybody. But we need to, as families, you know what success looks like better than anybody. We need to celebrate that success and be able to push for it. So let's move on to the next slide, please. I want to talk just a little bit about work experiences, if we could. I missed that one. Sorry. This is go ahead to the vision statement. That's perfect. I wanted to show this real quickly. The URL where these things can be constructed is up to the left there. This is an example of a young man in Georgia named Andy Meredith, and he created a vision statement for himself based on a lot of the things that we've talked about in this webinar. He, with his mom, put together this thing to basically tell the world what he wanted. And I just love to include this because for families, this would be a great opportunity for you to sit down with your son or daughter, answer some of these questions, fill in some of these boxes that are on the vision statement. And it's a great way to help your son or daughter drive the process. So I just wanted to include that in there, if we could. Let's move on then to the next slide, please. I want to talk a little bit about work experiences, because what we know is that young people who have meaningful work experiences in high school are more likely to have competitive jobs when they leave high school. And this is true for people with or without disabilities. And so if you take away one thing about preparing for employment from this presentation, it is that families really need to focus on and advocate for quality work experiences for their son or daughters in high school or out of high school. And work experiences can mean interviews with people in jobs that son or daughter is interested in, job shadows, volunteering, internships, or an actual paid entry-level job. These are all great work experiences. But, you know, driving towards this idea that people need to practice work, I think is really, really important. Now, the next slide talks a little bit about how families can help young people find these work experiences. Now, everybody on this call has a professional or has a personal network, a network of people that you know in your personal life, in your professional life, in your family life, colleagues and friends and family. And these are the people in your life that you can access to help find work experiences for your son or daughter. Let's say that your son or daughter is interested in working with animals, but you don't know anybody personally who's a veterinarian. Let's use that example. You are a member of a book club, however, and while you're taking a break discussing the book, you say, does anybody here know of a veterinarian that I could talk to about getting my son just seeing what they do? And somebody in your book club says, yeah, absolutely, I know a veterinarian. Let me talk to him. That's an example of using your personal networks to be able to cultivate opportunities, because we know many jobs are not listed in the want ads anymore. Many jobs are not listed at all, and they're found through these informal networks. So we really like to encourage families to use their own networks to be able to cultivate these work experiences that we're talking about. Next slide, please. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but we also want to stress the importance of building responsibility. You know, every young person who wants to be employed should have, you know, some basic idea of what is necessary to have in terms of skills on the job. And the way most of us built those very basic interpersonal skills were through chores that we were assigned at home. So I encourage families to assign chores, to build responsibility through accountability of getting schoolwork done, through practicing communication skills. You know, how do you greet somebody? How do you answer the phone? And again, it's okay for young people to take risks and experience failure in some of these areas. The goal here is really that they give a good effort. We want to see young people give the best effort that they can give. And that's all you can ask of anybody. And when they're practicing some of these skills, you know, I told families a lot when I was doing workshops, having a disability is no excuse for not doing the best that you can do. And that's really what we're trying to get across with that particular concept. Let's move on to the next slide, please, which we're talking a little bit about also leveraging school to be able to prepare for employment. And really, all I want to say here is that the IEP, if your son or daughter is still in special education, the IEP should contain goals related to preparing for work after school. And if you don't feel that your son or daughter's IEP is addressing the specific needs that your son or daughter has to build those skills, then you should advocate for those or have a conversation with your special ed team leader. And if you feel as though this is not something that they're amenable to, then I would certainly encourage you to contact either the ARC or the Federation for Families or another one of the advocacy groups in Massachusetts. They can help you work through some of the IEP stuff. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. We just got a few left here, and then we'll open it up to questions. You know, I talked a little bit about myths around employment, and I think that it's important for us to touch on some of these myths in the next slide, Carrie, so we can all be on the same page and kind of understand what we're talking about, people with disabilities. You know, misinformation and misunderstanding can really hold us back in terms of considering employment. So, Carrie, can you, oh, there we go. So a couple of myths on this slide. You know, people with disabilities don't work fast enough. They won't be accepted by coworkers. Sheltered work is safer than community jobs. People who leave workshops will lose all of their friends and contacts. People with significant disabilities don't need to work. You know, these are all myths that are out there, and they still perpetuate to this day related to people with significant disabilities in employment, and they really act as a barrier. And so we encourage families, you know, not to heed, you know, if you hear those myths, they're not true, and they should not act as a barrier to employment. Let's move on to the next slide, because there's also a lot of myths regarding Social Security benefits. And I'm hoping that the Work Without Limits is still the program that provides benefits counseling in the state of Massachusetts. That's what I was able to find anyway. If it's a different program, we can correct that a little bit later. But the one thing I want to mention about Social Security benefits is that I know that a lot of people, a lot of families work very hard to get their son or daughter on Social Security benefits because they're told that this is kind of a magic bullet. You have to get your son or daughter on Social Security. But what we're finding is that the Social Security benefit itself does not allow people to live independently in their community. The national average rent has outpaced what the maximum monthly SSI allotment is, for example. And so we encourage families to explore the benefits of paid work, because paid work alongside, you know, some benefits will almost always result in more income for your son or daughter than actually just relying on benefits. So don't see benefits as your magic, the magic potion. It really is something that we are trying to steer away from completely as the only option for people with disabilities. So a few takeaways is, again, have high expectations and set a vision for employment. Celebrate and cultivate your son or daughter's strengths and interests. Your son or daughters are amazing, and they all have strengths. So celebrate those strengths. Recognize the challenges that they may face to employment, and ask the right questions of the right people to address them. And as a family member, find the information and support that you need to be able to move forward here. And that is an important concept for me, is that, again, I'm not trying to get you to do something that you don't want to do, but I would encourage you, if you have questions, ask those questions and get all the information you can before making a decision. I would say let's open it up to questions right now. It gives us about 10 minutes, and let's see what people have out there, and what your reactions are, anything that might pop up. Can you put the next slide up, Carrie?
Sure.
So that's oh. We got some feedback.
Yeah, getting some feedback.
Okay.
I'm just, everybody still muted? I'm just checking. Yeah, I don't see anybody unmuted, so I don't know where that came from. But anyways, I'm having a hard time advancing the slide. I don't know why, but I'll keep trying. But meanwhile, if you do have questions, just chat them in.
Hi, this is Judy Fisk. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yep, I can hear you, Judy.
Hi.
Did you want to ask a question?
Well, I'm from Worcester, Massachusetts, with the Worcester Public School Transition Program, and I do a lot of communication, community collaborations, and we often think of just getting the jobs or the services are for the young adult with disabilities. But in actuality, when we engage individuals in the community together, I do a lot with colleges in the community, that people get to know each other, same age peers. There's a lot of social modeling that goes on, but more importantly, people get to know each other. And it is less about the disability and more about who the person is. So I think when we engage with folks in the community on a personal level, not just with the focus being work later on, but there are so many other parts to what people do and how they learn and skills they can transfer to that workplace. I think we forget that as much as our students and young adults are learning, so is the community.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's a great point. And that relates to kind of how perceptions are changing, and expectations that people have that they might not even know where they come from. But if you can create those opportunities for interactions, you're really breaking down a lot of those barriers. I appreciate the comment.
Okay, anybody else? And it's best if you chat in questions, because when we unmute you, we do get some feedback. So here's a question from Randy. Who can provide individualized employment supports for my son? My son can't drive or be safe by himself. He'd need a one-to-one support. Are there resources for this type of support?
Well, Randy, I appreciate the question. And, I would imagine, yes, that there are resources for that type of support. Me coming in from the outside, it would be difficult to answer specifically who you would contact. And I may even defer to Carrie or even Margaret, who might be on the line, to see who would be the very first call for this parent who is looking for some support. Do you guys have an idea?
Yeah, Sean, this is Carrie Mahoney, and I think it's important to talk about work in, like as Sean was saying, in the various steps and the various paths. So competitive employment may not be step number one, but are there things that can lead to that? So have there been some kind of career exploration? Has it been part of the IEP? Has it been part of the transition plan to look at exploring different types of careers and seeing what types of things your son is interested in and successful at, and then looking at how can that then be you know follow through with actual employment. So I hope that answers your question.
If she had specific questions, could she contact you directly, Carrie?
Oh yes, yep, no problem. Okay. Anybody can connect with me at the ARC. Okay. And then Marie had a question.
We'll go for it. Yep.
Yeah. Marie says, you mentioned supports that promote community employment. Where do you find those supports, these supports? If you'd like me to take that, Marie, I mean, that's, DDS can provide some of that, Mass Rehab Commission, the school system, sometimes parents or find their own supports and get them hired through the adult system. There's something called agency with choice. So if you had somebody who was able to help your son, you could enter into a co-employment model with an agency and be able to, assist with providing him with the coaching that he needs. The workforce is an issue, but working together with the provider agencies, hopefully that can be successful.
Really in that one, the point is that, some information that families get tend to point families away from the idea of community-based competitive employment. And so when people are talking to you about supports, be mindful of what they're telling you in terms of options and kind of gravitate towards the ones that are providing options for employment in the community. Okay. Anybody else? Let's see.
Okay, so this is from Margaret. For adults who are eligible for DDS services, DDS does contract with providers to develop individual supported employment opportunities and some level of ongoing job coaching. Supports can be provided on a long-term basis, sometimes.
Right. And so for that first mom that asked us, specifically, again, I would encourage you to contact Carrie directly at the ARC of Massachusetts and get connected specifically with some of the folks that can answer your question.
Okay. And I also wanted to add that, Sean, yes, Work Without Limits definitely does do benefits type of education and assistance, and then also through the Mass Rehab Commission. They have benefits counselors in each part of the regions that can assist you with understanding about Social Security and working and how those two intersect. And you do not, my understanding is that you do not have to be a Mass Rehab client to be able to receive that. So those people are on the mass.gov/Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission, and they can, if you look at the transition services for people, you'll be able to get their contact information. Okay, any other questions?
Well, Carrie, I just want to thank you for this opportunity. Thank everyone who was on and your great questions. And tomorrow I'm doing a webinar for professionals on some strategies to better engage families. Hopefully, some of you might find value in that as well. But thank you to Margaret and Carrie again. This has been fun. And if you have any additional questions, I would point you towards Carrie over at the ARC.
Okay, well, thank you, Sean. appreciate the time and your expertise. It was a great webinar. So I hope you folks join us again. At the end of the session, you're going to be automatically rerouted to a 5-question survey just on your webinar experience. If you wouldn't mind just completing that, that helps us with planning for future webinars, as well as knowing how we can improve our services. So thanks, everybody, and have a great day. Bye.
Excellent. Thank you.